Hi friends, welcome back to Author Notes. I'm Tanya E Williams. Let me ask you something. Have you ever picked up a historical novel and realized halfway through that the story wasn't really about what you expected it to be? Perhaps it's about something quieter, something hidden just beneath the surface. Because many of the new historical fiction releases arriving in June seem to do exactly that. On the surface, we have stories about mapping land, royal scandal, and Hollywood glamour. But just underneath, these are stories about what's been buried in families, in institutions, and in history itself. So today, I'm sharing 8 historical fiction novels arriving in June that may not be what they first appeared to be. This is where we take a look ahead at the historical fiction arriving in June 2026, and the stories readers may soon find themselves thinking about long after the final page. Let's begin with the books arriving first on June 2nd. June opens with a remarkable cluster of releases, and the first is quietly powerful. Land by Maggie O'Farrell. This story takes us to Ireland in 1865, not long after the devastation of the Great Hunger. A father and his young son are working to map the land, literally charting the country for the Ordnance Survey. But what struck me about this premise isn't just the act of mapping. It's the idea that the father, Tomas, wants his maps to record what happened, to mark the absence, the loss, the history that others might prefer to forget. And then something happens, an encounter in the woods that changes him and leaves his son trying to understand what fractured inside his father. This feels like one of those novels where the landscape itself carries memory, and where the story is as much about what lingers as what is seen. A Pair of Aces by Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray. From there we move to New York City in the 1930s, into a story that feels very different in tone, but is no less compelling. This novel follows Eunice Carter, Manhattan's first black female prosecutor, as she sets her sights on one of the most powerful figures in organized crime, Lucky Luciano. What makes this story especially interesting is how she plans to take him down, not through the crimes everyone expects, but through the network of women caught in his orbit. Alongside her is Polly Adler, a woman running a high-end brothel who has her own reasons for wanting Luciano stopped. This is one of those stories where power shifts quietly, through alliances, strategy, and women working behind the scenes. The Windsor Affair by Melanie Benjamin. Next, we step into the glittering and deeply complicated world of the British monarchy in the 1930s. This novel explores the relationship between Wallis Simpson and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, 2 women often positioned on opposite sides of one of the most famous royal crises in history. But instead of retelling the abdication from a distance, this story looks at it through their eyes, which raises an interesting question. How much of what we think we know about these women was shaped by the roles they were expected to play? This feels less like a story about royalty and more like a study of perception, rivalry, and the cost of being seen. An Artful Dodge by Karen Oden. From royal drawing rooms we move to the streets of Victorian London. This novel follows Kit, a young woman working as a pickpocket in an all-female thieving ring. And what I find especially compelling here is that Kit doesn't want this life forever. She's saving, planning, trying to carve out a different future. But just as she's on the verge of leaving, a former leader returns with a plan that pulls Kit back in. Stories like this often sit right at the edge between survival and choice. And this one seems to ask, what does it take to truly leave a life behind? The Chateau on Sunset by Natasha Lester. Next we head to Hollywood in 1957, inside the legendary Chateau Marmont. At the center of this story is Aria, a young girl sent to live among aspiring actresses and fading stars. It's a setting that feels glamorous at first glance, but very quickly it becomes clear that this is not a place built for someone like her. What stayed with me in this description is the idea of learning to become invisible in order to survive, and then beginning to question whether invisibility is really what you want. This feels like a story about growing up in a world that expects you to disappear and what happens when you decide not to. Before we move on, I'm curious. Of the books we've talked about so far, is there one you've already been drawn to, or one you hadn't heard of before today? Let me know in the comments. Releasing June 9th, Daughters of the Sun and Moon by Lisa C. This novel takes us to 1870 Los Angeles through the lives of 3 Chinese women whose paths converge in a city that does not welcome them. Each woman arrives with different circumstances, different expectations, and very little control over what happens next. What stands out here is that the story isn't told through a single lens. Instead, we see how these women, each navigating her own version of survival, find connection in the midst of hardship. And knowing Lisa C.'s work, this is likely one of those novels that balances beauty and brutality in equal measure. Releasing June 16th, Liberty Street by Heather Marshall. This story moves between 1961 and 1996, beginning with a young journalist who goes undercover inside a women's prison. At first it feels like an investigative story, but then the timeline shifts, and we begin to see the longer consequences of what happened inside those walls. What makes this premise especially compelling is that it's inspired by real events, and it seems to explore not just physical imprisonment, but the quieter ways women can be trapped by circumstance, by silence, or by the past. A Fortune of Sand by Ruta Sepetys. This novel was originally slated for June, but now appears to be releasing at the end of May, so I thought I'd include it here. Set in Detroit in 1927, it follows a young woman who enters an elite arts program that feels increasingly unsettling. Locked doors, missing women, a benefactor who seems both magnetic and dangerous. This one leans more toward historical suspense, and it's built around a question that's hard to ignore. What happens when the opportunity you've been waiting for isn't what it seems? When I look at June's releases, what stays with me isn't just the range of settings or time periods. It's the sense that many of these stories are exploring what lies beneath the surface. Hidden histories, unspoken truths, lives that don't quite fit the version of events we've been told. And that's often where historical fiction feels most powerful. Not just in what it shows us, but in what it helps us notice. Before we finish today, I'd love to know which of these June releases has caught your attention. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy discovering new historical fiction each month, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode of Author Notes. Until next time, happy reading. How much of what we think we know about these women was shaped by the roles they were expected to play? This feels less like a story about royals. Oh God.